afternoon. My name is Eric Wright. I'm the education specialist for the Wisconsin Veterans Museum, and we'd like to thank everybody for coming out today and joining us for our Curator conversations. Today, we're going to be talking about the legacy of Billy Mitchell, Milwaukee native. And we have with us today our Curator of History, Mr. Kevin Hampton, and also the Director of the Wisconsin Veterans Museum, Mr. Christopher Kolakowski. And they are going to be taking control of this discussion today. But before we get started, I just want to thank the Wisconsin Veterans Museum Foundation and their executive director, Ms. Jennifer Carlson, for all their fantastic support that they always give us for all of our virtual events and our in-house events as well, which I would like to add, we are going to have our first one coming up next week on August 4th. If you still have some availability in your schedule, we'd love to see everybody come out for that event, and you can find that on our website, wizvetsmuseum.com. We're going to be welcoming Mr. Gary Francis Powers Jr. to the museum for a special lecture. But that's getting ahead of myself. Thank you, though, to the Wisconsin Veterans Museum Foundation. And of course, thank you to our sponsor for all of our virtual events, Generac Power Systems. We're very happy to have them on board and being able to provide these virtual events to everybody out there. Before we get started as well, I just want to remind everybody that if you have any questions for us today, please send them via the chat function. You can send them directly to me. I'm going to be getting all the questions, putting them together in a PowerPoint and presenting them at the end of the event. So please, if you have any questions, please use the chat function and send them directly to me. That'd be fantastic. And without any further ado, you're not here to listen to me. You're here to listen to about Billy Mitchell and Mr. Kevin Hampton and Mr. Christopher Kolakowski. Gentlemen, the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much, Eric, and welcome everyone. As Eric said, this is our final, or our second, or no, I guess it's our last Curator conversation for July. However, it is also the first since we've reopened. So if you happen to get a chance to get down to the museum, we are reopened to the public. We'd love to have you check out what we've done over the course of while we were closed. And actually part of that component, last time we talked, for those of you that are joining us since the last time Chris and I, it was the Chris and Kevin show. I seriously, I think that should be the new name, the Chris and Kevin show. But since the last time that we talked, we did talk about the gallery refresh last time and kind of the new stories that we were bringing in and the new interpretation that we were bringing into the museum. And three of those components, the three main interpretive principles, the three things that we really want you to understand about the Veterans Museum is that every veteran is a story. Wisconsin was there, and it still matters. And there isn't anything, I think, more timely or significant to talk about in the last couple of days, 100 years ago, that will hit all three of those pieces. Then, of course, a very famous now, I would say, or at the time infamous, depending on your perspective, which branch of service you were in, event occurred on the 21st of July, 1921. And Chris, what is that?
That is the culminating act, if you will, of the Atlantic bombing tests, which were a series of experiments run on captured German warships from World War I, designed to test ordnance against modern ship designs, but also designed, ultimately, the aviators wanted to prove that, in fact, planes could sink warships unaided just by themselves. And that, in fact, was proven with the sinking. They over a series of weeks before, they'd sunk a submarine, they'd sunk a destroyer, they'd sunk a heavy cruiser. And then on July 20th, and then ultimately on the 21st, they sunk a German battleship, the Ostfriesland. And that was the first time that a heavy capital ship of that type had ever been sunk solely from the air.
So now 100 years later, this doesn't necessarily seem like a phenomenon. You know, that this seems like almost commonplace. Of course, we know now, with hindsight, of course, being 2020, that it's very easy for air power to dominate the battle space. We've seen it in many examples since then, and we'll talk about those at the end. So we have to put ourselves into the mind frame of 100 years ago. You know, it's 1921. So looking at that context, we're also going to get into some of the personalities a little bit involved. But let's talk about the context of the lead up to these events in July of 1921. And I suppose we should probably start with Wisconsin was there, and every veteran is a story, with the man himself, which has a fantastic, if you ask me, eyebrow raise in his portrait. This portrait, of course, is the one and only Billy Mitchell. What can you tell us about Billy Mitchell, Chris?
Well, before I actually get into William Mitchell, I do want to start by putting this in context of where we are in terms of the development of aviation.
Mm.
The Royal Air Force in 1921 is 3 years old. The United States Air Force, as we know it, does not exist. It is the Army Air Service. He's wearing a U.S. Army uniform in this photograph. The Army Air Service had basically started as a part of the Army Signal Corps, and in the about 8 years before, 10 years before, and only had become an independent Army Air, or independent, had become raised to that level because of what had happened in World War I. Powered flight is only 18 years old. December 1903 is when the Wright brothers flew the first airplane. So the airplane is very much experimental. We're at that stage, and if you think about many different technologies, we are at that stage where a lot of times the technology's there, it can demonstrate its promise. I'm thinking of the submarine, for example. You look at the CSS Hunley in 1864 versus submarine warfare in 1914.
Yeah.
You know, you can see that there is potential. It's demonstrating potential, but technologically, it's still very much in its infancy. Most planes in World War II, most planes go 300 miles an hour, maybe more, can fly thousands of miles. None of that is the case at this point. As a matter of fact, if you get 100 miles an hour in some of those planes,
they fall apart
afterwards, you're doing really well.
Yeah.
So, and the foremost airman coming out of World War I is this man here on the screen. I do want to come back to your actual question.
Oh yeah.
William Lindrum Mitchell, who was born in Milwaukee. His father was a U.S. Senator, was a Civil War veteran of the 24th Wisconsin, was actually very, very good friends with the MacArthur family. Of course, Arthur MacArthur and his father, and then, of course, their son, Douglas. In fact, Billy Mitchell and Douglas MacArthur knew each other and had played together sometimes as kids. Because his dad's a senator, the Mitchell family, in fact, if you go to the Wisconsin Club today in Milwaukee, is the old Mitchell Mansion. If you go there and walk through it, you can see the standard of living they had. They were players. They were players in the city of Milwaukee and in the state of Wisconsin for sure. And Dad was able to get him a commission in 1898 as a private in the 1st Wisconsin. Doesn't see any action overseas, but after the war, Dad is able to get him a commission in the U.S. Army, and he ultimately will serve in Alaska. He'll serve a bunch of different places. And then about 1908, I believe it was, he saw his first airplane and fell in love with it and taught himself how to fly, took private flying lessons. And by 1917, when World War I starts, he's already a leading acolyte in terms of developing the airplane within the Signal Corps. That's in 1917. By the war's end, he has led some of the greatest air battles and largest air offensives in history, particularly the air campaign to support the offensives at Saint Mihiel and the Argonne, but elsewhere as well. And by the end of the war, I would say he's probably the most experienced air leader in the entire world. And if he's not the most experienced, he's on a very, very short list.
And he's certainly one of the senior ones in the American.
That's correct. That's correct. When he comes back and they set up the Air Service, he becomes the deputy chief of the Air Service with the rank of brigadier general, ultimately reduced to colonel in the post-war reductions. There's only one other Air Service officer more senior than him, and that's the chief of the Air Service, who's a major general, wears 2 stars. So Mitchell he's both the senior most, but he's also a leading acolyte for what the airplane can be going forward.
I liked your discussion about, how the infancy of aircraft and the infancy of flight and this, essentially it's experimentation. And you can even see that just in the construction of the airplanes themselves. We think of, aircraft in war, immediately the public mind will go to the shiny aluminum of the P-51 or something like that, or the Memphis Belle, if you've seen that. This is not at all the construction that we're talking about for the aircraft of the First World War. We're talking essentially wood and canvas and a few bits of metal, and that's really it. You think about it today, I'd be very curious who you could pay to actually try to do some of the stuff in those aircraft that they probably tried back then to begin with.
Well, and one of the other things I would mention is if you look at the inventory of today's U.S. Air Force, we buy planes, and this is true also of naval aviation. I don't want to leave them out here. We buy airplanes and keep them around. The B-52 is going to serve 100 years. You look at the service life of the F-16s, the F-15, the F-18.
Yeah.
In World War I, the planes that were flying in 1914 and 15 in some of the earliest air battles are light years behind the planes of 1918, like the one we have hanging from our ceiling.
Right.
Which then, if you compare the planes into the early 20s, through the 20s, and then the development of aviation in the 30s, which may be a whole talk for a whole other time, by the time you get to 1939, I mean, it has been, in those 25 years, it's been incredible, the pace of technological change.
Yeah. And not only that, but the understood role of what aircraft can do on a battlefield. Initially it's essentially no different than, the Lowell balloon in the Civil War, which is observation. And it's meant to be just that. It's a scouting opportunity. It's not really, the idea is not that it's a force to be reckoned with in and of itself, right?
It's an adjunct to the surface forces. And I mean that both on land and on sea.
Right.
And even as late as 1938, there are Army officers that are arguing, why does an airplane have to fly much further than 3 days march?
Yeah.
Because it's supposed to be an adjunct to the ground forces. The same is true in the Navy. The Navy wants to tie the aircraft carriers to observe the fall of shot of long-range fire of the battle line.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the doctrine of the United States Navy carrier force in 1939 time frame.
Right.
So this idea that the airplane, particularly masses of airplanes, can act on their own to shape the battle on the surface is a totally new concept. Even I was as late in some cases, I would argue, as 1942.
Yeah, I agree.
But definitely in 1921, there's tremendous questions about what can these things really do?
Yeah. Well, and up to this point, like we were talking about last week when we were geeking out about this on the anniversary, because that's what we do. We're the cool kids in the office. So if you think about it, up to this point, for centuries, if not thousands of years, warfare had been linear. It was surface level. It was whoever has the bigger stick at this plane of existence. And now, for the first time in human history, warfare isn't this, it's this. It adds that extra axis to the entire concept of how do you fight a war. And that's dramatic, and that actually will play into our next thing I want to ask you about, which is, all right, we've established what the background is for those that are advocating for air power. Now let's establish the other component of this, which is the Naval Forces. Because up to this point, of course, if you think about it, the Navy, especially in recent history in 1921, was the biggest investment, if you will, in the last, what did you say, 20 years, Chris, I would say?
I would say by 1921, oh yeah, most definitely. Speak softly, carry a big stick that wrote Teddy Roosevelt. This is the big stick he's talking about here is the United States Navy. And of course, this is the Great White Fleet on its way to do the circumnavigation of the globe, 1907 to 1909. Among the ships, battleship USS Wisconsin, by the way.
Yeah.
But the United States Navy in the first 2 decades of the 20th century has truly become a global power. And after the destruction of the German Navy at the end of World War I, is now the number 2 Navy in the world. And considering the building program that they are looking at starting to do in the 1920s, are probably going to be number 1, if they're allowed to do it, are probably going to be number 1 by 1935. One of the things, though, that's in all of this and should be remembered and has echoes to today with the looking at the prospects for the defense budget, 1920 Defense Act had set what we would call today the peace dividend, and it had set a peacetime armed forces. So the defense pie, budget pie, is shrinking relative to what it had been in the last 5 years of the previous decade. And so you've got the Navy pondering a major ship expansion building plan. You've got the Army and the Marine Corps, to a certain extent, looking at what the internal combustion engine between the tanks, the trucks, and the airplanes. This revolutionizes warfare. So there's a lot of questions about force structure. There's a lot of questions. There's a lot of money that needs to go into research and development for things like tanks and airplanes. So everybody's trying to get their piece of the pie. And that's part of the background of these tests, is to get a sense of where should the spending priorities be directed. And that's one of the things that propels these tests even to be set up in 1921.
Right. And if you're thinking about the Billy Mitchell's adversaries in these tests, so the naval commanders, the high-ranking brass, if you will, of the United States Navy, this photo here, this is their Navy. This is what they grew up with. You know, you're moving from this time when a lot of them, would have been about the age. These would have been roughly about junior officers in the early 1900s, probably, or maybe captains of ships, but certainly not the admirals that they are in 1921. So they know, this is all they know. You know, this power, this prominence, this, to establish your dominance as a global power, you must have a Navy. You must have the bigger ship on the ocean. And then you look at what happens in World War I, and you're looking at, Battle of Jutland, one of the largest naval engagements up to that point, certainly in terms of caliber of weapons that are brought to bear all at the same time, short of Trafalgar or something before that. And that's a huge boost to their mentality of the significance. Not only has the Navy been an investment and been the primary investment in recent, defense spending up to that point, it's also a status symbol, and it is this mentality that these are what the people are going into.
Well, in the fulcrum of your fleet, arbiter of naval supremacy is the battleship.
Yep.
As it has been for centuries, going back through the Spanish Armada and even back into ancient Greek and Roman naval warfare. It's been the battleship. But there are questions, and it's not strictly an Army-Navy thing, because there are a lot of Army guys too that look at naval power and think of it in terms of battleship.
Right.
But there's there's a tradition. The joke is that the joke in the British military is that the Army and Navy have traditions. The Air Force has habits. This is thousands of years of tradition of the battleship being the dominant ship type at sea.
Right.
And so when Mitchell decides to go out, when the tests are done and Mitchell is going to be bombing a battleship, it's a very open question as to whether or not an airplane can sink these types of ships and do it unaided from the sea. In fact, the Atlantic Fleet will be at the tests, prepared to sink any hulks that might be left behind. Of course, Mitchell's determined that there's not going to be any hulks, because he's going to sink them himself.
Yeah.
But all of this feeds into the mentality going into the test, and feeds into both sides know that there's a lot riding on this.
Yeah.
And Mitchell's determined to prove his point.
I think I was thinking of this just the other day, actually, over the weekend. It's a unique time period too, because you're just coming off of, just prior to World War I, you've got the Titanic and this idea of these unsinkable ships, size and scale and majesty all make this, the apex of human innovation, untouchable. In some ways, this is the Navy's Titanic moment. It's a strange analogy, I know, but it's in that same generational mentality too, because you go from 1912 to only less than 10 years later. Now, not only possibly can this massive new cruiser line be sunk by an iceberg, now you have a battleship that might be sunk by this little thing that's made out of twigs and canvas, really, and in that mentality. So let's get right into the tests, since that was like 20 minutes of background and context, with one eye on the clock. And let's talk about how this plays out, because this isn't actually the first test either. This isn't the first time anyone's tested it, right? This actually, the Navy tried their own test.
Navy did try their own tests, and very quietly in the fall of 1920, they anchored an old battleship, USS Iowa, in the middle of Chesapeake Bay, and then had Navy and Marine flyers drop projectiles on it, just to get a sense of.
Projectiles. That's an interesting word there, Chris. Why did you choose that word?
Thank you. The reason that I use that is because the projectiles that they drop are 100, 200, 250, up to 500-pound bags of cement and sandbags. So they're not actually explosives. And Wisconsin native William Leahy afterwards writes a report that says it is proven that airplanes cannot sink ships.
Yeah, if they're dropping rocks.
Yeah, they're not dropping explosives. And so when that gets leaked in Washington, all heck breaks loose. And it's like, this is not real. Some people have the same, are you kidding me?
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a legitimate test. And so Congress starts to exert its influence and says, you need to do real tests with real ordnance, and you need to involve the Army. And we see what this is about. Again, going back to that spending decision,
mm-hmm.
And starting to think about defense priorities over the next few years. And Congress is like, no. We are not basing it on this, whatever you call this thing, a test. We're going to do it real. You need to do it with real ships, real ordnance. And so that's why they do it in the summer of 1921. They end up anchoring the ships 50 miles off the coast of Virginia. And Billy Mitchell and his flyers are going to fly from Langley Air Force Base to do it. So it's going to be a true test of ordnance and ship design.
I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall for that discovery of that report. Like, I'm sorry, you drop rocks, and that's that would be, well, we don't need guns because we can still throw rocks at each other. Like, that's not, it's not even on the same playing field. All right. So we come to the point where the climax of our story here, which is, of course, the literal bomb, if you will, on the test itself. So let me pull up a picture here. Which one should I bring up first, Chris, you think?
Surprise me, Kevin.
Surprise you.
Yeah. So.
Oh. All right. So let's do this one.
While you're hunting that up, I will point out that there is a conflict of objectives over these tests. The Navy views these tests as science experiment to test varying types of ordnance. Mitchell is going to drop anywhere from Mitchell, and there are significant Army flyers, but there's also Navy and Marine Corps flyers that are involved in flying in coordination with Mitchell. And they'll drop anywhere from 125 bombs up to 2,000-pound bombs at various points during the test. And there'll also be some tests of strafing and things like that. The idea is, the planes will do their thing. They'll stop. Observers will go on board, assess damage, and then come back and signal. At that point, they'll raise a flag, and then the flyers will do their thing. The two basic types of planes, just so everybody understands, this is one of them, the Martin MB-2 bomber, probably the heaviest bomber in the United States inventory at the time. And that's going to carry the majority of your heavy bombs. And then the DH-4, which has much more in common with the Sopwith Camel, the stuff you probably think of when you think of World War I aviation, will do most of the strafing and drop the lighter bombs as well. Why are they not using torpedoes? I'm just going to head that question right off. Torpedoes are so in their infancy and development for airdrop torpedoes. In fact, the Navy is only just now starting to experiment them. Which Mitchell said, "Hey, let's use torpedoes." Navy didn't want to do that. They just wanted to look at bomb effectiveness. There's some DH-4s over Langley Field, and you can see down in the lower left there the infrastructure of Langley Field. Of course, today it's Langley Air Force Base, and is a bit obviously a bit larger and a bit more changed over time. But that's the idea, and that's the tools that they're going to use.
Okay.
Mitchell will, by the way, will perfect dive bombing, level bombing even on stationary ships, especially if there's any kind of wind. and especially with the technology in those days, is extremely difficult. And so Mitchell will train his men to dive, 60-degree dive, pull out, and drop the bombs. This is the first target, which is German submarine U-117. Most people on the surface ships expect that she'll be impervious. 3 Navy seaplanes drop spotting bombs, turn around, come back, drop 3 bombs in succession, and within 15 minutes, she's at the bottom of the Atlantic.
Wow.
What most people don't realize, and the German U-boats and our submarines will learn the hard way in World War II, thanks to enemy air power, is that the submarine's best defense is not any inherent structure. It's putting a lot of water between you and whatever's trying to kill you.
Yeah.
And a submarine on the surface like this, we know from obviously today and the experience of World War II and beyond, submarine on the surface is very vulnerable to air power.
Mm-hmm.
Mitchell proved that and showed that in 1921. That was a new concept in 1921. This is the Armored Cruiser Frankfurt on July 18th. She's already been, if you look real carefully, you can see she's already been strafed and bombed by the Marine and Navy aviators. Part of the thing was they wanted to see how badly this, you can see the superstructure's messed up. A lot of the weapons are disabled. They had strafed the bridge and probably would have killed the captain and most of the bridge crew and gotten what's called a mission kill. And then when Mitchell and his flyers set in on the Frankfurt in the afternoon, which is the first armored ship of the targets, they actually put a bomb down her stack.
Oh, wow.
And within an hour, she's gone. And that shocks a lot of people because the targets have gotten progressively more difficult. You've got had a submarine, then you have a destroyer, G-102, which I think is the photograph you flashed up just for a second.
Yeah, I'm trying to get to that one again.
And then you have the Armored Cruiser Frankfurt, and then ultimately you go to the battleship Ostfriesland. So it's a progressive level of difficulty, if you will. That's G-102. After lasting about an hour with Mitchell and his flyers. Yes, she's on fire.
Yeah.
They terminated her career with extreme violence. And one of the things that they did as well is it's striking the ship, but they also discovered that because these ships are designed only to repel shells, they don't have a lot of armor on the hull. So what Mitchell calls a water hammer is what they generate, where they'll drop a bomb near, and a near miss is as good as a hit because, think about like a can. You try and crush it from the top, like a soda can or something. The strength makes it very difficult, but you push it from the lighter sides, it's much easier to crush.
Oh, that's a good analogy. That's
really what they do. That's what Mitchell and his people do.
Yeah.
And you'll see it again at Ostfriesland. They do it with great effect on Ostfriesland in particular. But these ones, they go after them with everything they've got, bombing, strafing, and lighter bombs, and then go after them with the heavier bombs. And the German ships, they're gone pretty quickly.
Yeah. Let me see.
Which astonishes a lot of people.
Yeah. And the sheer, I would say the expediency in which it sinks is compelling. Certainly, we look at examples, throughout time, and one of the most compelling factors of any, ship sinking, in my opinion, is how much time happens between the moment you realize it's not able to be saved and the moment that it, goes under the waves. And the ones that go down the fastest, usually have that, largest amount of life lost, or don't provide the opportunity or the time needed to get people off the ship. And so you're looking at, later on examples, HMS Hood, for example, the Indianapolis, that goes down in like 13 minutes total. And that I think is a factor that it needs to be considered as well, because how fast it can happen. Up to this point, again, it's whoever has the biggest guns, because these two lines of ships, battleships, are just going to be hammering away at each other, broadside to broadside, on practically broadside to broadside, not terribly different than Trafalgar. But the idea is that usually takes time, because you have to get into position, you have to hammer back and forth, you get your range in. And generally, it's not as quick, I would say, as what has just been shown here through Mitchell's tests.
Warfare is speeding up. You're absolutely right. And I would argue that if you look at the development of technology after World War II, particularly jet aircraft, missiles, warfare has continually sped up since.
Right.
Now, when you consider some of the debates about AI and reaction time, that's a process that started in many ways, or that's a milepost in that process. This is another milepost in that process of warfare being faster. It's moving faster. The battle space is larger. It's much more three-dimensional. You're absolutely right. Of course, Mitchell realizes this is the prize. And he actually says, this is our real test, is the dreadnought Ostfriesland. Now, one thing I need to point out about these ships, and I'm going to grind an axe. If you don't mind, I'm going to grind an axe here.
Go for it.
There's a lot of misnomers about these targets, and it needs to be pointed out. These people are like, oh, these are old ships. They're worn out. They were wrong.
Yeah.
Oldest ship is this one, 10 years old. Okay. These are modern ships. The other thing that you need to understand about these ships, and there's a lot of debate, and we can get into some of this perhaps in the Q&A or perhaps a little bit later in the presentation. Yes, they're anchored. Yes, they're not defending themselves. Yes, they're not conducting damage control. Got all that. However, they are very suitable targets for this reason. The German Navy believed that the best first mission of a capital ship, like a battleship, and to a certain extent their armored ships, their armored cruisers, was to stay afloat. They revolutionized the idea of within the ship's inherent design, there's a certain level of damage control and flood control. And if you look at some of the damage that German ships took at the Battle of Jutland and still made it home, including this one, Ostfriesland had a hole blown in her hull by a mine, still made it home. This ship and her other German compatriots are worthy targets. This is I want to put that to rest right now.
Yeah, and that's very different than what the Navy again tried to use for their test the year before, because the year before or 2 years before, whatever it was, they used the old battleship.
USS Iowa that they used as a target had far more in common with USS Olympia that's now anchored in Philadelphia than it does with its namesake USS Iowa that's now anchored out in California.
Right.
So yeah, Ostfriesland is more modern. If you were to crew both ships and have them go toe to toe with each other in a gunnery duel, Ostfriesland would win 99 times out of 100.
Yeah.
It's just that much better and more developed of a ship.
Yeah.
So this is a worthy target and a worthy subject for the experiment. And Mitchell himself said, this is our real test. If we don't get this one, all other efforts will be diminished. This is one of the strikes on the morning of the July 21st, actually. They'll hit her over 2 days, July 20th and then July 21st. The Navy and the Marines will strafe the deck and go after her with lighter bombs on the 20th, and then Mitchell will go after her as well, leave her somewhat listing and badly messed up. I think we got a photo of that in a little bit.
Oh, yeah.
But this is the first strike of the next morning, and they'll attack in pairs 1 minute apart. And you can see that. And you can see the water hammer that they're going for. First of all, you see the explosion of the bomb right off the port side, driving water right into the hull. But you'll also look there to the starboard side where the smoke is coming off, and you'll see the remnants of the wave of the first explosion when the first bomber dropped it on the starboard side there. So they're getting her from both sides.
Yeah.
And that's the water hammer at work.
I want to show you that one because I think that's a good representation.
That's an even better depiction of it. You can see the same sort of thing.
You know, I that can analogy is really going to stick in my head because that's a fantastic. I never even thought of it that way before, but you're exactly right. Imagine, just a concussion on either side. Wow, excellent. Let's see here. What other ones we got? We got some really great photos, and that's actually, it's too bad. So one of the things, just for everyone at home, if you're watching this on YouTube afterwards too, open the search box there just above the video, because there's actually some really interesting and fantastic silent footage of the tests that happen. Can't show any of that here today, unfortunately. We don't have any in the collection necessarily, but it's definitely something that I would check out because it's very interesting to see it happen.
It's on YouTube because those are National Archives, Army Signal Corps, and Navy. And then photographs like this are available on the Naval History and Heritage Command website, history.navy.mil. And that's where a lot of these images come from. And they've got some reports. They've got some great accounts, actually. First strike on Ostfriesland on July 20th. And you can see they're hitting the decks pretty hard. And you can go on to the next one here.
Yeah, that was the one that I was hoping to start with, and I messed up the order.
That's all right, man. That's all right. I'll still walk you through them.
Let's see. Let's just go back. We'll just go through them in that order, I think. And you can tell me which ones to go to next. So we'll go back to this. I don't know which one my computer is showing.
It's still showing the first strike.
First strike?
Yeah, the one you had up earlier.
Okay, so let's go to that one. That switch?
Yeah, that's the water hammer.
Okay.
There she is sinking. And it's something that's worth pointing out. When Mitchell hits her again at noon on right after noon, she sinks shortly before 1 o'clock Eastern time. She's going under by the stern. They've really hammered her stern, and she rolls over. She's rolling on her back in this picture. She rolls over, and again, you can see the footage on YouTube.
Yeah.
She'll be actually turn turtle, and then the stern will dip, and the bow will be seen. The more poetic of us, I use the term claw at the sky. And then she goes. And when she goes, Billy Mitchell's rear seat observer, St. Clair Street, who later is instrumental in forming Strategic Air Command, stands up, unbuckles himself, stands up in an open cockpit and starts waving his arms and cheering and yelling, "She's gone, she's gone." And there's Street there.
In an open cockpit. Okay.
In an open cockpit. Billy Mitchell later admitted to having tears in his eyes. He said, "We wanted to sink her, but when it was done, it was a very serious and awesome sight." He realized what he had done. And then, of course, he recovers and buzzes the transport Henderson with all the VIPs. And if you look at that's his plane buzzing them. You can see the Atlantic Fleet kind of in the background there. And you'll notice some people are waving at him. Some people are waving their hats. But also, several of the surface admirals are seen openly weeping. Yeah. And there are some congressional representatives on there as well who've been observing the tests, and they look stricken. They look ill because they realize what this might really mean. An airplane has managed to sink every major type of ship then available in the service, in the fleet. Has over several weeks have just been sent to the bottom of the ocean by a small group of aircraft. And it's changed warfare. It's changed aviation. This is shortly before the last run. And I like this picture because that's the flagship there where you have your cursor. That's the flagship of the test, USS Chalmette. She's put observers aboard who've basically said, Ostfriesland, if she'd be lucky to make it home during wartime. She's effectively out of commission at this point anyway. But you'll notice how badly scorched her stern is. Yeah. Her bow is pointing at the bottom of the picture. Yeah. So you can see how badly scorched her stern is. And if you look real carefully at the waterline, you'll notice that she is noticeably down by the stern and noticeably listing to port. This is her the day before.
Oh, it's the day before. Okay.
This is the day before, right before everybody goes home for the night. You'll notice from the waterline that you're running the cursor along, she's already listing to port.
Yep.
And look at how messed up her decks are.
And notice the individuals on board. I just like to show that for scale. You can see them there on the rail.
And those are the observers. Those are the observers assessing damage. Yep. At this point, the night of July 20th, they said she's flooding. Not too badly. Good damage control could probably save her, but she's effectively out of action. She could probably make port. Okay. After the next run in the morning, a couple more water hammers, they come back and say she'd be lucky to make port.
And then it's this.
Then it's this. And then Mitchell comes one more time and sinks her. Yep. So you just did it in reverse order there, Kevin.
I did. See, I try and wind the clock back so we have more time to talk together.
Let's go with that. Let's go with that.
Sure, why not? All right. So we've talked about now what obviously the context and the perspective of the individuals involved, and especially both sides. And now as you poetically ended it there, like this has changed warfare. This has changed the perception of what's going to happen, what could happen. And I'll emphasize that it's could, because it's still not necessarily proven in a time of war. It's still, as you mentioned, a controlled test. So there is elements of warfare that could not necessarily be replicated, except that we're going to see a very clear, a clear proving of the point only 20 years later, right?
Right. And I will say the objections at the time, based on 1921 technology, the idea that these ships could have dodged the bombs, all this stuff, based on 1921 technology, is probably correct.
Yeah.
But I draw everybody's attention back to what we talked about at the very beginning about how airplane technology and surface ship technology as well, but airplane technology continues to move faster and faster and develop. So the airplanes of 1921 are very different from the airplanes of 1939, 40, 41, 20 years later. And you will find that the objections, which are still being voiced, and quite frankly, are still voiced some today. I heard some last week from people saying these tests didn't mean anything. The ships weren't maneuvering. It was a publicity stunt. I absolutely disagree. And but that mentality was still out there. But they didn't take into account how the airplane had developed and how air tactics had developed in the next 20 years. So that by the time you get to World War II, it is very possible, and in fact does happen, that Mitchell's feat is replicated. And I can run through those in the interest of time fairly quickly. We don't necessarily need images for those, I don't think. Except one. I do want you to bring up Force Z.
Oh, I can do that.
The Italian fleet in Taranto attacked in port November 1940 by British biplane Swordfish. They knock out in a few minutes, knock out half the Italian surface fleet, several battleships. So that replicates Mitchell's feat. The Japanese study that. It partly inspires them to do the same thing to Battleship Row, which you just had up as well, December 7th, 1941 in Pearl Harbor. And of course does tremendous damage to Battleship Row, sinks several ships, damages others, and basically knocks out the fulcrum of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. Of course, this is a famous photograph of Battleship Row on Pearl Harbor shortly after 8 o'clock in the morning.
We can't go into too much detail into this one, Chris, though, because this is what we're going to talk about in December. So join us for that one. The 80th
for that one,
of
yes.
Pearl Harbor.
There's a lot to talk about in this photograph, but we'll move on. Now, granted, this was a surprise attack, but nonetheless, in wartime conditions and defended anchorages, ships defending themselves and conducting damage control have been sunk solely by air power. 72 hours after Pearl Harbor.
Oh, wrong one.
Wrong one. There you go. 72 hours after Pearl Harbor, HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse, Force Z, engage 85 Japanese bombers and torpedo aircraft off the coast of Malaya. That's Prince of Wales to the north, or to the top of the picture, and Repulse having just endured a level bombing attack down there. One of the best battle cruisers in the Royal Navy, one of the most modern battleships in the Royal Navy is Prince of Wales, one of the best battle cruisers being Repulse. In 2.5 hours, the Japanese sink both ships. And Winston Churchill later said this was the greatest shock of the entire war, because now it is clear modern battleships, maneuvering, conducting damage control, conducting defense, can be sunk solely by air power. And this is what Mitchell prophesied in 1921. And it will happen again in 1944 and 45. The two most powerful battleships ever built, Musashi in October 1944, Yamato in April 1945, will both be sunk solely by American carrier air power. It takes a lot to do it, but both are sunk by carrier air power. And then the most powerful German battleship Tirpitz, sister to the Bismarck, is sunk solely by RAF Lancasters, and that's one of the airstrikes on Tirpitz by RAF Lancasters in November 1944 in Trondheim Fjord. So it's clear. In fact, that's one of the kill shots right there. The 12,000. They dropped 12,000-pound bombs on and around her. She died a violent death. Yeah. But it proves, just in case anybody needed any further proof, that the era of the battleship, which had been foreshadowed by Mitchell 100 years ago last week, has in fact come to pass. Yeah. And from this point forward, the aircraft carrier will be the keystone of any global battle fleet.
Yep. Now, I'll make a quick comment too about that Force Z. With Prince of Wales had a very interesting career actually up to that point, right? The year before had been involved in one of the more famous naval engagements, which also involved air power, chasing down and hunting down the Bismarck.
Correct.
And of course, it is the air power that ultimately seals Bismarck's fate, with the Swordfish dropping a torpedo and disabling her rudder. So there, though, you're still dealing with this concept of whoever brings the bigger gun on the bigger ship. It is that dreadnought arms race almost, because you have the Hood versus the Bismarck. You have all these other larger cruisers in the Royal Navy trying to stop this large German battleship. And at that point, the Swordfish happened to, it was more of not an afterthought, but it was more of a just throw everything at it and see what we can do to slow it down. So when you get to Force Z, when it's again the Prince of Wales, there is no, like we talked about at the beginning, there is no bigger ship to shoot at. You can bring the biggest gun you have, it won't do you any good, right? Because there's nothing to actually shoot against it from your main guns.
It's interesting when you think about the real advance of the airplane is that there are many advancements. As a matter of fact, the general board that assessed the tests in 1921 said it's obvious that the airplane is a powerful offensive weapon of war. They said that in 1921, the day after Mitchell sunk Ostfriesland. Mm-hmm. The thing about the airplane is it's a radical advance in range of firepower. And I would submit that it's similar to what you're seeing now with the anti-access, anti-denial, or area denial missiles and cruise missiles that you're starting to see come on the scene more and more. This idea of extending the battle space, and being able to cause more problems than just looking through a viewfinder and targeting the other ship on the horizon. Now you can go over the horizon and then come back, reload, and do it again. And it's all part of this evolution of warfare. Really got its start and got its shot in the arm in 21. And here we are 100 years later, still wrestling with many of the same concepts, albeit obviously in a different technological form. But what Mitchell foreshadowed has come to pass and continues to come to pass. Mm-hmm.
So with one eye on the clock, I want to make sure we've already addressed, I think, the why it still matters. So we've hit our 3 interpretive principles for those of you playing tic-tac-toe, not tic-tac-toe, bingo at home, or, our coworkers who I'm sure have a Chris and Kevin show bingo card at the ready. But either way, so how do we go? Because we know Billy Mitchell today, especially here in Wisconsin, as the namesake of an airport. We know Billy Mitchell today, if you're a student of World War II history, because of a bomber, because it's the Mitchell bomber, which, Chris, you pointed out, the only individual to have, or to be the only model aircraft to be named after an individual.
Yeah, that's right.
But, and you'd think, based off of those 2 facts alone, if we don't know the history of it, he proves this massive shift in warfare in 1921. He's got this, he's a visionary, he's almost a prophet, has a prophecy of how things are going to go, except in his own time, he doesn't necessarily, endear himself to everyone involved in the process. And not necessarily, people in 1921-ish probably 1922, certainly 1925, wouldn't necessarily have been able to see an airport named after Billy Mitchell because of how he behaves a little bit after the tests. And so in the next 4 minutes, Chris, give us a life cycle of Billy Mitchell post-test.
I'm not even going to take 4 minutes because I'm very curious at the questions. I'm going to probably do this in about 30 seconds. Billy Mitchell is the deputy chief of the Air Service. The problem is that, and you can get a sense of his personality from this picture. The facial expression says a lot. His mouth gets him into trouble a lot of times because he's very forthright in his views. As far as he's concerned, there should be an independent U.S. Air Force today, just like the British, today being 1920s. There are a lot of people that favor the more gradual approach that ultimately is taken, where it's the Air Corps in 1925, the U.S. Army Air Forces in 1941, and ultimately the independent U.S. Air Force in 1947. Mitchell wants all that to happen right now. And he's not afraid to ruffle feathers. He gets exiled to Fort Sam Houston in the summer of 1925, basically to get him out of Washington and remove an irritant to a lot of people that are getting in the way of what really needs to happen with the Air Corps. While he's down there, a blimp, USS Shenandoah, goes down on a tour. It goes down in Ohio, kills most of the crew.
Dirigible, yeah,
dirigible, a blimp. And was on a promotional tour, flew through some bad weather, probably shouldn't have been flying, had some maintenance issues. Mitchell writes all this up and publishes it and distributes it to the newspapers. This long screed about how if they'd only listened to him, and basically that the Shenandoah shouldn't have been up there, a lot of good men were lost, all this other stuff. But he uses words like traitorous and treasonous. He talks about the treasonous conduct and the dereliction of duty of the War Department and the Navy Department. And oh, by the way, the Commander-in-Chief of the United States military, who, of course, is President Calvin Coolidge. Now, our audience, I know, has a familiarity with the military, but you don't even need a familiarity with the military to know that is insubordination 101.
Oh, yeah. I don't know what you're talking about. It's totally fine. What is that?
And he's court-martialed for it, deservedly so.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one thing. He's not court-martialed for any of his theories. Most of his theories end up having some modicum of played out, including the prediction on the attack on Pearl Harbor.
Yep.
He's prosecuted and he's court-martialed and convicted for insubordination, and I think deservedly so. He's suspended for 2 years without pay, but before the sentence can be carried out, he retires from the U.S. military. He dies of a heart attack in 1936. He remains active in defense affairs, writes several books, and is buried in Milwaukee in 1936. So that's Billy Mitchell. He is, I argue that Hap Arnold, is the father of the United States Air Force, the godfather of the United States Air Force, and somebody who basically Hap Arnold said, I built the Air Force based on what I learned from the guy, Billy Mitchell.
Yep. I agree.
And so that's his place. His place in air power history is firm.
Yeah.
But it did not end. The old line, wait until the evening before judging the day. Well, he had a very dark evening at the end of his career.
Yeah. I will say there's the way some of these story arcs intertwine. The fact that the Shenandoah is a naval command. Once again, you find a critique of the Navy. It's the Navy's attempt at taking command of the skies. That's what the whole dirigible arm of that development was, and obviously that fails dramatically. The other component that I find, like all these, the stars aligning, the fact that MacArthur, who is on his court martial,
correct.
Clearly, I mean, he argued, I know later on in life, that he was the only one that, was against it, essentially. But I also know that the Mitchell family didn't necessarily ever know fully if he really did or did not vote, go side with Billy Mitchell. But the end of his career, the end of MacArthur's career, not perhaps as vocal in choice of words. It didn't, at least that I know of, called Truman a traitor or a treasonous act. But it's interesting how these personalities encountered each other throughout life and throughout history and almost have parallel stories.
The United States military at the time, when you consider how small the officer corps is, these guys all intersect.
Yeah.
And if you look at some of the names, we didn't get into it today, but if you get into some of the names that are involved in the Billy Mitchell court-martial, or some of the names that are involved in this test, and you see what they end up doing in World War II and beyond,
Yep.
it is, you realize it's it's not like these guys all just came together for World War II. There's decades of relationship prior to that influences and makes a difference in terms of how, and that might be a whole other talk for a whole other time.
I think we'll have to, because just like we talked about today, the mindset of what the commander, like what the naval brass, if you will, the high command, what their frame of reference was: Great White Fleet, Dreadnought race, Battle of Jutland, the pinnacle of the battleship, and knowing what that was is just as instrumental as the junior officers or those individuals, those officers that are involved throughout Billy Mitchell's 1920s career, because they're the ones that dictate World War II, just like you said. So I think that'd be an excellent way of talking about, what you learn when you're a junior officer and how that informs decisions made despite, changing technologies, or with changing technologies, or being open to changing technologies. With that, I do want to just say one last thing. I think this eyebrow raise is one of the best things I've ever seen. It's almost like I dare you to court-martial me.
And on that lovely note, Eric, what questions does the audience have for us?
We do have a few questions, Chris. Let me bring those up.
I had to get that in there. Come on.
Actually, good segue there.
So the first question, Chris, was there any voice within the naval ranks that looked at the potential use of aircraft in the same frame as Billy Mitchell did?
There were naval air power advocates. Matter of fact, the tests give them a major shot in the arm as well. It's no coincidence that by the late 1920s, you see the first aircraft carriers and the first experiments with air doctrine.
Mm-hmm.
So there's absolutely some of that. Two people that I would commend to your attention on the Marine side is Roy Geiger, who is one of the great pioneers of Marine aviation, flew in the tests, and becomes a very powerful advocate for Marine air. And then a bunch of guys who are kind of lost to history, with one exception. That's Felix Stump, who later is probably most famous for his Navy Cross at Leyte Gulf on the morning of October 25th, 1944. But it's not necessarily the naval participants, but it's the admirals around it, and the admirals on that assess the tests, that realize that the airplane, well, they said it themselves, the airplane is a powerful offensive weapon of war. And so the Navy realizes we need to take these forward. A retired admiral actually said in his report on the test, he says, in the future, next battle, the side that has the more powerful air force will be the victor. And so he speaks for many in the naval establishment and said, the battleship remains supreme. You see that in the structure of the Pacific Fleet in 1941, but air power is going to be a big part of whatever the future for the Navy is. And there were a lot of people that were pushing that in the Navy.
The next question, Chris, how did the German, and I think you've touched on this already, how did the German ships that they used compared to what the U.S. Navy was using at the time?
If you compare Ostfriesland in 1918 with, say, USS Nevada or USS Arizona, it's essentially a push, with the exception of the damage control. In fact, that's one of the things the Navy learns a lot about, is how to make compartmentalize a ship and make flood control a part of this naval architecture by studying Ostfriesland and other German ships as well. So, but otherwise, the capabilities are, in terms of size of guns, range of operation, speed, pretty close in most other respects.
And then the next question, what were the thoughts of, the sinking of the Ostfriesland taking a couple days? We're used to seeing, one or two runs and you can sink pretty much anything. But this taking a couple days, did that have some kind of factor in the mindsets of those that were viewing these tests?
I think it did. And I also think this is where you get a lot of that. Well, it's just a test. It wasn't maneuvering. It wasn't conducting damage control. You make a run on the 20th. Had this been wartime, Ostfriesland would have been able to escape the area. And so I think that's probably the greatest impact of it. At the same time, battleship people are like, well, look at how much ordnance it took to finally kill Ostfriesland as well. And so it's like battleships, if you put it in wartime conditions, have a chance, which again, in 1921 technology probably is a viable argument.
Mm-hmm.
Less so by the 30s, late 30s, early 40s.
And where can you find, you guys talked about the silent film footage of these tests. Where, can you remind us again where we can find those?
You can find those on YouTube, actually. Several different sites have uploaded them. Their National Archive of silent film. And it's something, just, go to YouTube and search 1921 Billy Mitchell test or something like that. That's how we came across them, at least.
Next question. Why did the Americans not pay enough attention to Billy Mitchell's demonstrations and reports and Harry Yarnell's war games in 1932 as the Japanese did?
The $64 question.
Mm-hmm.
And Kevin, we can get into this in more detail in our Pearl Harbor conversation in December.
We will.
I will simply say here, Mitchell's prediction about the Pearl Harbor raid, and then Harry Yarnell, for those of you who are not familiar, actually bombed Pearl Harbor in a fleet exercise in early 1932 and demonstrated the technical feasibility of using aircraft carriers, because he used two, to strike the U.S. Pacific Fleet base at Pearl. The difference is, those are exercises. They prove they can be technically possible, but nobody in 1941 credited the Japanese with being crazy enough to steam 4,000 miles with 6 fleet carriers, basically gambling a significant portion of your fleet to then bomb Pearl Harbor. And I think that's probably the essential thing that we underestimated the will of the Japanese to carry out the operation. And that's why again, foreshadowing what we may talk about in December, but I think that's the biggest difference right there.
Yep.
And then our last question, Chris, and I think you guys have already touched on this. Oh, wait, sorry, this is not our last question. Who were the other personalities involved with these tests? Anybody as gregarious or flamboyant as Billy Mitchell?
Hap Arnold comes to mind, who's later chief of the U.S. Army Air Forces and the only 5-star general in the history of the U.S. Air Force. We've already talked about Street and what he does. One of the flight leaders is a guy named Clayton Bissell, who later commands 10th Air Force in the China-Burma India Theater in 42, 43. Geiger, one of the pioneers of marine aviation, who's involved. There are reports Jimmy Doolittle was part of Mitchell's force, but I can't find him in the sources that I've consulted of the pilot roster. I can't find where he actually flew in the tests. But Jimmy Doolittle, from what I can tell, was present and was involved in some of the training and preparation flights at Langley. So you've got, those are probably some of the most prominent names of people that are involved with the tests that you may recognize from later.
Okay, and I think this is our last question. Yes, and you guys have already touched a little bit on this as well. Was Billy Mitchell court-martialed because of his comments from the tests?
No, the court-martial was solely the comments about USS Shenandoah. I will say his comments about the tests, which he repeats when he writes his book, Wing Defense, which if you want to read his account of the tests, he devotes an entire chapter to. He publishes it in 1925. And that's big reason why he gets sent to Texas, is because he's taken it just one step too far advocating for air power. And that gets him down to Texas, but then ultimately it's solely the Shenandoah wreckage and his comments immediately thereafter that get him court-martialed.
I'll jump in here, Eric, quick before you sign off and say that that's actually a good segue, or this is a good chance to segue. Join us next month in August, actually August 9th, for our next installment of the Chris and Kevin Show. I'm really going to get this one to stick, I swear. And we're going to have a debate, actually, between Chris Kolakowski, obviously our director, and our curator of exhibits, Greg Krieger, facilitated by myself, maybe nudging a little bit and, doing that Celebrity Jeopardy-esque approach. But either way, we're going to have a debate about which was the best fighter craft in the European theater during World War II. We're going to take this idea of Billy Mitchell's legacy and continue it into our discussion next month.
Awesome. Well, we're looking forward to that, Chris, or I'm sorry, Kevin. And I just want to remind everybody as well that if you did miss a portion of this segment, or if you want to just go back and rewatch it in total, it will be available on our YouTube channel probably by Wednesday of this week. We get these turned around rather quickly and posted on there. So if you want to go back and take a look at this, you're most certainly welcome to do that. And then as well, I want to remind everybody that we have our movie night discussion coming up this Friday. We'll be talking about the movie The Last Full Measure. And then as well, like I said at the very beginning of the presentation, we have our first in-person event coming up next week, next Thursday. And you can find all this information on our website, and you can sign up for all our events there as well, wisvetsmuseum.com. All of our events are always free, thanks to our Wisconsin Veterans Museum Foundation and to Generac Power Systems for their continued support. Kevin, Chris, it was a great talk today. And I know that not only you two could go on talking about this, but I think everybody that was involved with us today could go on listening about this as well. It's a really interesting topic, and we're going to have more to come associated with this, like you mentioned, in December and then also in August as well. Thanks everybody for coming out today. We hope you have a wonderful rest of the afternoon. If you're in Madison, try to stay at least a little bit cool. If you're elsewhere, I hope your weather is treating you better than we're being treated over here today. And we'll see everybody for our next event.